first speaker. Coming today directly from Phoenix and Arizona, we have Scott Whitmore with us. Scott is a researcher at the Mayo Clinics based in Phoenix, Arizona. He's currently working with several groups throughout the world to address access, privacy, and security issues faced by patients, researchers, public health officials, and healthcare providers. Scott, I know it's very, very early in Phoenix right now. We really appreciate you coming up and joining us early in the morning, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, being early in the morning, the sun is just coming up and the background behind me will lighten as we go. So let me get my presentation going here. My name again is Scott Whitmore. I work as a research technologist in the brain cancer research lab at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the issues that we've been facing as researchers for a number of years is access to data and how to get access to data. We have amassed over the last 20 years the largest collection of brain scans and clinical data that we know about on the planet. And it's taken that long, and we've had to work with a number of people and deal with all sorts of technical issues dealing with images and data, and even today our clinical side is all manual curation. We read records in, type data in to the system. This is a universal problem, and so I'm going to show you a picture of the current state here, where healthcare systems and insurance providers in the US and other organizations outside the US lock data behind firewalls, and that's a firewall there, and act as if they own the data. And in fact, legally, the copyright for patient data belongs to the provider. And that's part of the problem. As you can see, and one of the things that the coronavirus crisis caused or highlighted was the difficulty public health officials have in accessing data in terms of who's got what, where, tracking the disease, an epidemic, figuring out who needs to be vaccinated, who gets vaccinated, who's been vaccinated. We have a reporting system that's delayed. It's several days late. It takes a long time to bubble all this data up to the national level. So the information we're hearing on the news might be the latest information available, but it's not the latest information. So we needed a way to fix that. So this is our current state. Among the issues, and you can see that the center in that building there with third parties, healthcare providers and insurance providers act as if they do own the data, and so they sell it, and they may de-identify it or they may not, depending on the nature of the thing. But there are deals going down now with healthcare providers, including the Mayo Clinic, providing data to companies like Google in exchange for analytics. What Google does with that data after we get through is not clear to me. And so our lab hasn't participated in that, but we're just not sure what's going to happen with that information. But we understand that that's how it is today. Patients have little or no say in who gets that data or how it's used or how long it's used or for what purposes. So these are some current issues. The biggest one is the patient's not in control of the data, and there's a global movement afoot. My Data Global is an organization out of Finland that is set up to advocate for individual ownership of their information. Adjacent to that is patient control of patient data, so that the patient is in direct control of their information. Now, one of the things about working at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona is that we get a semi-annual migration of people. The city population almost doubles in the wintertime. It didn't happen this year because a lot of the people stayed home, but normally what happens is we get these hordes of people coming in that can move down here for the winter and bring with them files of records, medical records, because they have two sets of doctors. They have a doctor at home and they have a doctor down here, and they get care here. It's one of the reasons that the Mayo Clinic's in Phoenix. And I've seen some of these folders, they can be several inches thick. So portability is an issue. The other thing that's interesting, and this struck me as strange, is if you've ever watched a radiologist or a clinician look at a patient's information, they're looking at two different screens. And I don't mean two screens on the same system, I mean two different systems. On one side, they have the radiology information, the images. And on the other side, they have the clinical data, and they're going back and forth. And integration of imaging and clinical data happens in the head of the observer. They're not integrated. We've done that integration in our lab so we can actually show relative to time points in a patient's treatment cycle where images have occurred, the information from the images that has been captured, and show that as a graph. We're the only people that can do that right now because we're the only place where patient images are integrated with data. Data is acquired as a result of providing service to patient. It's not purchased. In other words, there's no commercial consideration given for acquisition of this data. In fact, the patient pays for that service, and so the data is acquired as a result of that. So why ownership sits on the rests with the provider is an interesting question, because they're not the originator of it, and in fact they didn't pay for it. They have a lot of bilateral sharing agreements. The only way to get data out of an institution today is to enter into one of these bilateral data sharing agreements. Now, ours in the US are controlled by institutional review boards and the HIPAA regulations, and in Europe they're controlled by other regulations. But you still have to negotiate with each sharing partner to get data and to use it, how it's used and when it's used for. That might require reconsenting patients. It might require a lot of paperwork. Data is sold. Companies sell data without compensating the patient. So my personal data, my images, my clinical results would be sold to some company for analytics purposes or whatever else they wanted to use it for through one of these bilateral sharing agreements that I really had no say in. I may not have to consent directly for that because there may be some fine print, one of the consents that I signed earlier, that says that the provider is allowed to share data for business purposes. And then finally, it's difficult to acquire data for public health and research, as we've discussed. Those are two different problems. They require different solutions, somewhat, although the solution will look the same, as we'll see in the end. So these are the issues we currently face. Anybody who's been involved in the research side of the medical profession, knows what this is like. If you're trying to coordinate clinical trials across sites, you see they have the same problem. They've developed explicit data transformation or data sharing languages. HL7 and FHIR is used for clinical records. And these information exchanges are limited because there are a series of bilateral data sharing agreements, and that they just agree to share data in that format. Data is not necessarily available. So what are the consequences of this? Data is often shared for profit. Derived data is owned and licensed so that the company who creates derived data has information. There's been some movement in the My Data Health organization to claim that continued use of derived data and machine learning information models and so forth for profit could hamper medical education, much like some other things now where use of information is restricted, even to the point where you can't share it with your peers or with your students, because it's like you have to pay a license fee for that. So they're getting to the point now where there's a concern among medical professionals that derived data and AI learning tools and the results of those AI learning tools would have to be paid for in order to even discuss, which could hamper things like educating young doctors. So there's a potential issue there that is just now being spoken about. And that's that potential harm to medical education. There was a story out of Texas recently, maybe 3 weeks ago, about a woman who had breast cancer, but who had been diagnosed as not having any cancer, and was actually sent a letter by her hospital that said that she was found to be cancer-free. Well, it turned out the diagnosis was wrong, and her lawyer and a forensic investigator discovered evidence, and this hasn't been proven yet, but they've discovered evidence that the healthcare system, which had just been acquired by a corporation not too long before this, was actually changing medical records to hide the fact that they'd sent her this letter to limit their potential liability. So we have what amounts to, and that's just one example of nefarious data modification. And I think this has gone on a number of times because this particular lawyer has seen this a couple of times and other lawyers have modified it. So it was a very alarming, from my view, story to read about. That case is ongoing. I don't have results for it yet. But the idea that that can happen, and I can see how that could happen without an audit trail, is something that we need to worry about. And then there's this whole patient as product mentality. We all know that, you know, when you sign up for something like Google or Facebook, you're the product. It turns out that a lot of provider systems and health insurance companies and other organizations that collect this data treat the patient as a product, and they sell the data as if it was theirs. Now, in our case, in our lab, we've gone to a lot of work to acquire and add value to this data, and by work I mean thousands of hours of labor. So we've added value to it, so that's worth something. But the original data came from some patient, and it really belongs to that patient. So what are the solutions to this? And this is what I'm going to propose, or I'm not proposing a specific solution. I'm proposing a shape of a solution, of which there are a nearly infinite number of actual possibilities if you get into the details. And the idea is that these pressures that we're facing now and that have been exacerbated by the pandemic are highlighting the need for change. And there's been a boom afoot for years, and it's just accelerating and growing faster to move into a new way of managing health data. In addition to that, there are pressures on cybersecurity. Healthcare systems are one of the main targets for cybersecurity, both in ransomware and data breaches. In the Mayo Clinic in particular, because of our celebrity client base, has very sensitive information and very valuable information in its system. Now, we have to pay a lot of money every year to protect that data, and we go through a lot of training. We go, you know, information security is one of the biggest things that we have in our system in terms of training. Everybody has to go through information security training. Many years ago, convenience stores realized that if they didn't carry cash on hand, they wouldn't get robbed as often, or they wouldn't. What you don't have can be stolen. We took that lesson. I worked at Nordstrom several years after that, and during the time of the Target data breach, when all those credit card information was stolen from Target, we realized that the convenience stores had a point. If you don't have it, it can be stolen. And so we were working on ways to get credit card information off of our store networks, because then we don't have to spend the effort to protect the data that we don't need anyway. It's not part of our daily business. We can rely on the banks to provide that information because it's really a transaction between us and the bank. And then that credit card information is between the bank and the cardholder. So it's really not our business. Health data is going into that same mode. And I'm going to present my next slide here so we can get a picture where we're headed, where the expense, the trouble, the effort required to protect data is becoming increasingly onerous in terms of diverting resources from providing medical care. A healthcare system expends a significant portion of its resources to analyze, to control and protect and back up and make sure the data is high quality and so forth. What they really should do is collect it and give it back to the patient. And there's an organization called Health Record Bank Association that has been established to advocate the creation of health record banks, which is like a data vault. It's an organization that exists solely to collect and protect information, in particular health records, in a way that is controlled by the patient so that the patient gives consent, either electronically or some other means, to share that data, to use it, to make sure that providers can access it when they need to, so that, and they're all electronic, so everything's electronic, including imaging. That's part of the puzzle. And the other part of the puzzle is all the technology to make this happen. And you can see here the change is that the records are no longer controlled behind the firewalls. They're used by healthcare systems and insurance providers. They're also used by researchers, other third parties, and public health officials, but the patients control who accesses that directly. So if a public health official puts out a call for data, a patient can then decide whether or not their data will be contributed to that. There are a number of ways to implement this, but the common characteristics of all of those is the patient is in control. The data is electronic in form. This is our portable health records that we've been trying to get to in the United States for about 25 years. It's interoperable, it's searchable, it's organized anatomically so that data about the brain is organized by the brain. So you can search for information by body part, either macro or microscopic structure. You can have any number of ontologies for anatomy to use to organize this data. So it's a matter of just taking a piece of clinical data and attaching it to one or more anatomical structures. And that's done as part of the data collection process. And so you can say, you could put out a search to say, I want images of the brain and I want certain characteristics and so forth. And the search engine would find that and return a list of potential patient identifiers, not the data, not the patient, that you would then have to go get consent from. And you can do all this electronically. And it's integrated, so that imaging is integrated with the data and it's no longer separate. You don't have to go to, even today with the information exchanges, the image itself is actually still behind the firewall where it originated. It's not part of the health exchange record. The record just points to it if you look at the details of FHIR, for example, for an image. So where does the data live? There are many options in this for this case. One is that we could widen the silos and go virtual, and so the data could start out where it is today, and the systems just provide access to these health record systems, which could be a virtual system where data is not copied, but it just lives where it's generated. Companies like Cerner and Epic could then provide gateways into their data, which they don't today, and getting the information out of Epic is a monumental task, even for somebody who's on it. And Cerner was not to rub dirt on Epic. Cerner was just as bad, because we used to be on Cerner, and then Mayo Clinic went system-wide over the course of about 3 years to Epic. The problem was getting data out of the clinical system there was no gateway to do it. It wasn't easy to do, and so we kept the manual process. So you could widen the silos, and it require work on the part of healthcare systems to provide access to this information, or you could create centralized stores of data and create these health record banks. How it goes in the future, I think, is predictable based on the pressures that are driving the process in the first place. We're going to start with modified silos because nobody's going to just wholesale send their data off to a bank. First of all, there aren't enough banks around to do that. And secondly, the healthcare system is very conservative in terms of being risk averse. We'll eventually move to health record banks, and data security is going to drive that. The problem today is that if you insist on protecting data, you have to be world-class at data security and information security, and there isn't a healthcare system in the world that can afford to be world-class information security specialists. So what's going to happen is you're going to hire information security specialists who run these data vaults, and their sole function is to protect data. So they're going to be really good at it. And I think we're going to be driven there by security. I believe that the payment card industry has already been there. Today, it's very rare that when you purchase something online, that when you go to enter your credit card information, you're not talking directly to the bank. On the bank site, using a secure connection outside the merchant's visual, what they do is they send you to the bank site. The bank takes the information, validates your card, and sends a token back to the merchant. That token is a generated identifier for that payment card that's unique to that merchant, so that the bank now knows that when that token shows up, it's from that merchant. If it's not from that merchant, it's fraud. And so that's one of the advantages that happened over the last 10 or 15 years or so. So the medical records are going to go that way, and it's just a matter of the good guys versus the bad guys. And the bad guys are always a step ahead, and how it's going to happen is the health records are just going to, providers are going to say, we can't afford to do this anymore. We got to focus our resources on medical care. So we're going to turn it over. The other question that's going to drive this is who pays for it? Who pays for these centralized records in this new patient control system? If providers continue to pay for it, either providers or payers, they're going to act as if it's their data, just like they do today. So we're going to get behavior that we don't want, and it's not nefarious or anything. It's just human nature and behavior like that. So we're going to have to move towards a situation where the patient pays for that storage and the health record banks. And one of the advantages of the health record bank, at least in the latest research that I've seen, is that a health record bank costs about $5 to $10, maybe $15 per year per patient. So the cost to a patient might be $20 a year to store their data in the secure vault and provide all this necessary access. Now, access is the hard part. The vaulting part and the getting the data there has been the easy part so far. That's we know how to do that. The problem is what happens in the meantime, and how does it all work? How do you identify patients? Who provides the identifier? And there's a lot of work in that. And I presented here the Trust over IP architecture, which is the product of the Trust over IP Foundation, of which I'm one of the groups I'm working with. And their position isn't necessarily health records, but their function is this 4-tier architecture of digital trust that you can see layers 1 and 2 are digital trust in terms of communication techniques. And then layers 3 and 4 are ecosystems and applications built on top of that. Layer 1 are these utilities. The World Wide Web Consortium has developed some standards on distributed identifiers, which is a self-sovereign identity. The issue to be solved yet there is it uses blockchain or a ledgerless method called carry to use for authentication purposes. They're both publicly available data that allows anybody to validate a digital signature. The problem is, how do you make sure that somebody who claims to be Scott Whitmire is in fact Scott Whitmire in terms of creating these identifiers? And so initially, there's going to be some identity validation of who is the person or the entity creating this identifier. But once the identifier is created, it's immutable. It can easily be verified, and its history is known. Level 2 are these wallets, and they show a mobile phone because Apple Wallet, Google Wallet, the electronic wallets for payment cards is the applicable model here to show how things might work. And so you would get notifications on your wallet that somebody wants to access your data. You'd be able to query them and find out why, and there'd be some communication work, but it'll all be within the wallet. The wallets then decide, the wallet vendors decide which blockchain to use or whether to use a blockchain. So that's all determined by the wallet vendor. So they decide what happens at layer 1. At layer 3, we have what are known as verifiable credentials. And a verifiable credential is a digitally signed entity, payload. It might be attached to a medical record. It might actually be the medical record. We have, it depends on what whoever implements it decides. So this is where the options start to explode. But the verifiable credential is a digitally signed, cryptographically signed document that can be verified as to its provenance and whether it's been modified. So this would solve the problem of a health system modifying health records, because you could prove that they sent that letter and they could not erase that track. And so that the various modification of records is no longer an issue, because you can tell when that happens, and it's all publicly available information. Now, the contents of those verifiable credentials is not available. That's not what, they're all encrypted. The information itself is usually kept separate from what they call these DID documents. But the documents are information about metadata about the credential, such as who sent it, the public key to decrypt it, what its history is, how it's been applied, when it was created, what blockchain it's on, and that kind of, and where to go to find the actual contents. So this is what the layer 3 verifiable credential, and right now we're working on building verifiable credentials for all of the FHIR resources that we use here in the United States. At layer 4 is where the applications. This is where the worker, the people live, the healthcare systems, the providers, the researchers, the public health officials, and the patients all live and work in layer 4, using applications that are built on the infrastructure below. So the technologies in layers 1 to 3 are blockchain, a new ledgerless replacement that doesn't require a blockchain called carry, and then self-sovereign identities. One advantage of carry that we've been looking at is somebody, well, actually it was me, asked the question, so what happens when the blockchain provider decides they want to quit doing business? Or what happens when your health record bank wants to go out of business? They just they don't want to exist anymore. They got sold out, or the owners retire or whatever, because organizations don't exist forever. So we're looking at keeping records in perpetuity. So carry is a way to do that, because it doesn't require any infrastructure other than the utilities to interpret the information. It doesn't require somebody to maintain a blockchain. It doesn't require the sovereign network or the other blockchain networks to exist. Self-sovereign identities is a self-organizing, self-managing set of utilities that work on several principles of cryptology. And so that doesn't require an organization to be there either. DIDCOM is a specification put out by the World Wide Web Consortium that supports the communication of at layer 2, and one of the properties of that standard is that organizations can create private key pairs. In other words, a public-private key pair between them and another organization, so that when Mayo Clinic communicates with Banner Health, for example, here in the Valley, they use a set of public-private keys that exist only for that communication. So they always know that when a communication is legitimately from the other party on that line. And so and it's similar to what the banks have done with merchants today. And so when a patient communicates to a provider, they'll use their private key that only the patient is in the patient's wallet. When the provider then shares that information based on the permission the patient gave them with another organization, they'll use a different private key to encrypt that data, so that the receiver of that data knows that it came from the original provider. So that's what layer 2 is all about, and it provides that information, that ability, and it's fairly slick. And it's about ready to go live for a number of things. One of the things we're looking at is COVID vaccination passports. Europe is looking at implementing that, and there's a group that's fairly far along in that, using this kind of technology. Layer 3, we're talking about FHIR and HL7 for structure only. It would be that structure, so that anybody who has a health exchange could actually interpret the data. And then there's an architecture called overlays capture architecture, which is a series of overlays that allow data to be modified in passing without actually changing the original schema. It makes it, easy to translate, to add labels to it, to customize it so that a receiver of the data can apply their own overlays to the data that's in the thing, in the original resource, and in fact convert it to their system. It's like XML transformations in real time. And that's been around for a while, and we're making use of that. So the layer 4 ecosystem looks like this. We have an issuer. An issuer is somebody who creates a verifiable credential, and then there's a holder. And this is particularly describing IDs, but it could be any verifiable credential. The holder is probably the patient, so they're going to have this. Their health record bank is going to hold their information. A verifier is going to access this health record bank and then verify the issuer and with the governance authority that this hasn't been modified, that is in fact who generated it, and that whole process. And this all happens under the covers. The governance authority is an organization that organizes all of this and writes the rules and decides who gets to play and what the costs are. And I labeled that the hard part because it's not clear where that authority should rest. Probably not a government, but that's probably where it's going to start. I think somebody like the Veterans Administration is going to be the first out of the gate in that kind of thing. And hopefully their transformation is not a typical government project, but more along the lines of something like this, where we get truly portable records that we can then extend this ecosystem to other parties other than just the Veterans Administration. So it's not a closed system. So that's the thing I'm working on right now is who should be this governance authority. Right in the payment card system, that's MasterCard and Visa and somewhat American Express, and some of those like Discover. Those are all governance authority because they create rules and methods and processes for making the thing work. And that would be the job of the governance authority. Now the question is, who funds that? You see here a couple of options. It could be a government agency, could be somebody like the World Health Organization, United Nations, nonprofit organizations, foundations, or healthcare systems. Could be insurance companies or for-profit companies. Could be governance systems. It could be all of the above. I mean, any organization can create a network, and all they got to do is get patients to sign up for it and pay them to maintain it. And then what goes on, how they organize it behind the scenes is hidden. And so you could have some networks that are virtual, where the data is controlled by the providers and maintained by the providers in virtual, but it looks like as if it's a healthcare record or healthcare bank or health record bank. And other organizations will create health record banks. And in fact, the health record bank may in fact be the governance authority and sign patients up, and then they create agreements with their healthcare providers to participate. From the standpoint of accessing it through the wallets and so forth, they would all work the same. So it wouldn't matter to any user how the stuff was organized under the covers. The big question is, again, and I mentioned this earlier, is how is it funded? How do we pay for this? Who pays for this? And that's a difficult question because ownership goes with who pays for it. But charging patients for that kind of thing is difficult to get started. So it's an interesting question. It hasn't been solved yet, and I'm open to to input if somebody wants to join the effort. We have a lot of room and a lot of activity. I'm involved in an IEEE standard that is defining what amounts to verifiable credential structures at layer 3 to be used by such an ecosystem, with the ethics that go along with it. So there's a lot of effort already that you could join in and participate if you want to. So with that, I'll terminate my presentation a little bit early, a couple minutes, and then we can go into our question period.
Thank you very much, Scott. Fascinating view of what's going on. I think that, well, I certainly did not know about all that's going on behind the scenes in this area, and it's fascinating. And so, you discussed this a little bit already, but just to reinforce, what are kind of the groups that are collaborating to build this it seems like a vision and a structure and a governance that's being built right now. What kind of the main groups that are collaborating on that?
Well, the main groups are My Data has a health organization that is advocating patient control of data. They're not actually implementing any of this. They've been advocating. They're out of Finland, and they've been pushing for standards and policies. Very light on implementation. The Trust Over IP Foundation was formed last year, as a matter of fact, and its job is to build the infrastructure that these ecosystems can live in. So it defines the rules for what happens at layer 1, the communication between layer 1 and 2, and that whole technical architecture part of it. So they're driving the technology behind that. But even they're not really focused on healthcare records. It's people like me that look at health, My Data, and the IEEE standard that is going on, and the Trust Over IP, and say, you know what, all these parts could play a role. And so there's a small group of us, probably 10 or 15 people right now worldwide, that are working on integrating all of these options and policies and trying to figure out how to make this work. So it's come together rather quickly, in about 9 months or so, but it's taken a number of years to figure out what the problem was and then where the parts are. So the pieces are all available. It's just that nobody's built the thing yet. We've got the pile of Lego bricks. We just haven't built the model.
Very, very interesting. And from a legislative standpoint, is there anything happening in Washington that that's along those lines, or it's a big influencer to what you're doing here?
Yeah, there's been a long-running debate about national patient identifiers here in the United States, which would be roughly equivalent to a social security number and probably just as valuable. The problem with social security number is that it started out as an identifier, a public identifier, so it was like your name. And the problem is it's gotten extremely valuable because it's used to access all sorts of information. So now you have to protect it. Well, a medical record number, which every provider that I've contacted has one for me, is just as bad, because with that number I can actually get into it. So identifiers probably won't work, but that's been ongoing, and there's been some debate about whether or not that's even a good idea. That effort's been going on for probably 20 years or more. Europe is doing some other things, and then their data sharing regulations are getting more strict, and patient control or personal control, the right to be forgotten, and that kind of thing are hampering some of these efforts. I think that the biggest influence will be something like the Veterans Administration Transformation Project. If they go down the right path, or a path where the data is more of an open structure, even though it's a closed system, because it's closed in the sense that they only have to get, the only people who can play are the people they invite. So they would be a great governance authority. But if they go down that route, then that would be a huge influence towards everybody else following suit. Somebody like the Mayo Clinic, Providence is working on with a company called Lumedic, which is building a similar system for the Providence families of healthcare systems. So it's going to happen eventually, and we'll see, how long it takes. But it's the Wild West at this point. There are no rules.
That's fascinating. William Fuller says, "What a fantastic presentation and insight on what's happening in this area." And he asks, first of all, he thought it was a great concept. You have a great concept slide there. And he says, imagine that the patient actually being the central focus of healthcare, because that's what the picture that you had. What a novel concept. And then he follows that up by asking, what do you think it would take to make individual health data owned by the individual, by the patient, much like intellectual property? Do you ever see that taking place where, I own my data and it's my intellectual property type of thing?
I do, and I think a number of things are going to cause that to happen. I think legislation will drive some of that, and I think healthcare systems will decide that, I don't want to be responsible for this anymore, so I'm going to give it to the patient and let them protect it. because the information security and the costs of a data breach are accelerating astronomically. I mean, they're just exponentially worse. So that liability is going to drive that. You know, once a healthcare system loses a bunch of patient information, which has happened yet, but it hasn't been one of the major breaches, much like the Target credit card information. Once that happens, you're going to see a scramble for something like this because liability is going to drive it. The idea then would be from a healthcare provider system is that, okay, we've collected all this data, we need to use it, but we don't want to own it. We want you to take care of it. And so that's going to drive the development of such an ecosystem. I think that's part of it. Legislation may start it.
That's excellent. Another question that comes up is that there is at least a perception that that Europe is farther ahead when it comes to these topics in terms of discussing these topics and taking maybe some legislative action on patient kind of data protection and distribution and use and so on and so forth. The question is that perception real or not? And is Europe ahead of the game right now? And there are lessons for us to be gained from looking at what they're doing?
Yes. In terms of perception, in terms of ideas, of looking at, there's of recognizing the problems. My data is coming out of Finland. It was started in Finland. There's a whole movement afoot to protect personal data, and Europe is by far ahead of the United States in terms of moving towards personal control of information. The U.S. is way ahead in some other areas from a technology standpoint and figuring out how to make all this happen. But in terms of understanding the problem and moving towards a solution, Europe is ahead of us. I think the first systems will be implemented there, mostly because their environment is set up to receive that much better than ours. We have a number of huge roadblocks that will have to be dealt with in the U.S. in the marketplace just to make that happen. So I think in that sense, the perception is real. We're learning a lot in terms of why a person should be able to control their own data. I mean, that's just something that never occurred to us until a few years ago.
And is there a framework, the framework that they seem to be moving with, similar to what you're proposing here, or it's something that's significantly different?
What we're proposing would be compatible with their system. I mean, their rules, data sharing rules and so forth, once the patient is in control and controls the keys to all that data access, we've met their regulations. I think that the system we're talking about is not necessarily designed to satisfy their problem or their regulations, but it certainly would. We're looking at something that is truly global because we have all of my activity in this area is early in the morning here because a lot of the people involved are in Europe. So we are working across the pond already and with Asia as well. So it is a truly global effort.
Very good. Another question that has come up that I'm looking at here as an overall theme has to do with the readiness of these underlying technologies that you talked about. I mean, blockchain, yeah, it's there, perhaps. How mature are these technologies to support what you're proposing here, or which areas you think that there still needs to be, significant technology development before we can materialize this vision?
Blockchain is fairly well established. They're working on implementations of carry, which pass key event logs back and forth to validate history of a key. Basically, is how you validate the provenance of a document. The distributed identifier is up and running. The Sovereign Foundation has implemented that and is working on that for identifiers like driver's licenses. There's groups in Europe trying to put their passports online, that kind of thing, things like that. So there's a number of efforts to do this. So the technology is progressing. It's not ready for prime time yet. It will be by the time the market is ready to receive it, because that's going to be the hard part. So it's not mature at this point by any stretch of the imagination, but it is being used, and it's the same technology that's being used in other areas where you want online documentation and digital trust. And so we're piggybacking on efforts that are existing now. So we're not creating anything brand new, and it's further along than you might think.
We have time for one more question here. So you mentioned this, but I want to follow up and make sure everybody understands. There are different organizations who are working on this system right now, and or maybe this vision and developing what's needed. What is the best way for people? Lots of people in the medical community here are asking, you know, how do I get involved? What is the best maybe entry way for participating in some of the discussion groups or supporting somehow? Are there any resources that you could share with us?
Yeah, the two organizations, My Data Health and Trust Over IP, allow individuals to join at no cost. Basically, you sign some non-disclosure agreements or some documents that you agree to play by a certain set of rules, and then you participate. And you're a full member. I'm an individual member of Trust Over IP Foundation, and I participate in a number of groups. They have working groups and task forces and even project teams that you can get involved in. Right now, there's 3 of us that are working on translating FHIR creating OCA overlays for FHIR, so we can, that's the data layer. There's an IEEE standard organization that is involved in creating the data structure, which is the, what are the entities that are the data model that is required for this online medical record, and how do you connect it to anatomical structures. And actually, we're recruiting participants on that standard now. So if you wanted to connect me, I could route you to any one of these organizations. So there's the IEEE standards effort, there's the My Data, there's Trust Over IP, and they're all accepting participants on an individual basis and at no cost. So you don't have to pay a lot of dues. Just time. It's a lot of time.
That's right. Scott, what a great presentation, great insights on this vision, such an important area that I think that is built awareness to so many who are with us today. So thank you for taking the time to share that expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Scott Whitmore, directly from Phoenix, Arizona, with the Mayo Clinic, talking about this very important questions about patient data and rights and governance for that. I mean, these are very important items in our current current and future healthcare system. So great insights. Really pleased by that coverage, which we don't see very often. Honestly, at least from my perspective, I have not seen it addressed at that level of depth. On what's happening with those organizations that are building this vision and framework for patient data. We are going to switch gears when we come back up at the top of the hour. We're going to be inviting our an operational excellence leader from Sanofi. She is the leader for research development in North America for Sanofi, and she's going to talk about empowering excellence in research and development. We can do better science by operating more efficiently, and you do not want to miss that from one of the top operational excellence leaders in R&D in this space. And we're going to be back with her at the top of the hour. In the meantime, for those of you who have additional questions, want to know what speakers are saying, want to know what participants are saying, check out the LinkedIn post that we have for this session. Is under my name, José Pires, on LinkedIn. And you can connect with Scott Whitmore, by the way, directly from that, because I have his name listed there. Just click on his name, connect with him, tell him in your invitation that you are attending BTOES Healthcare Live, and you want to know more, you want to participate in some of these groups that he talked about. So there are updates that I post on a daily basis to that posting on LinkedIn. So engage on that if you have additional questions, if you want to contact one of our speakers, that is the best path for you to do that. So thank you for now. See you back up at the top of the hour.